Welcome to VintageDrumsTalk.com. Jim Messina here. Once again, folks, if you're looking at me right now, you have reached the live interviews page of Vintage Drums Talk. And this is where we talk to notable collectors and prime figures in the vintage drum community. And I'm really excited today because we've got a special interview. We've got none other than Mr. Harry Cangany special. Harry, how you doing today? Good to hear from you.
Fine, Jim. I'm doing fine. How you doing?
Oh, I'm just doing fine. I'm really elated that you finally agreed to sit down and talk with me right here at Vintage Drums Talk. I say we get right into it and talk about some vintage drums and the whole vintage drum community and just what Harry Cangany is doing today. What's your status as today as far as the vintage drum world?
Well, I still buy things and turn around sometimes and go, I've got too many of this or whatever, and then I get rid of things. And what started as, one or two drums years and years ago, I think at this point I've got about 85 snare drums and 32 or 33 sets, and every time I look at them I think, no, wait a minute, why do I have all these? and I remember at one point, years ago, having 130 snare drums and about the same number, 35 sets or so. I went, what am I doing with all of these? And I got rid of a bunch of things. I thought, well, what I'm going to do is really focus on the 60s because I love that time, because I was playing then. And then the next thing I know, I turned right around and I bought a whole bunch of things again from the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, and I laugh. And I'll say, well, I don't have one of those in red. I never had a gold sparkle one of those. And,
I've done that myself.
I know I got 85 snare drums again.
Sheesh. Now, when was this? When you started first collecting, how did you get into this in the first place?
Well, I decided that after having not played for a long time and coming back and going into a general music store, I didn't see the brands that I was used to. I didn't see Ludwig, and Ludwig was still in business. This is the late 80s.
Okay.
I didn't see Ludwig. I didn't see Slingerland. I didn't see Rogers. I didn't see Gretsch. And I thought, what the hell? Where are the brands that I know? And what I did was do a really quick catch-up in the time I wasn't playing. I had learned that the Japanese companies had really gotten big, and some American companies were gone, and other American companies weren't always stocked by at least this music store. And in talking to a couple of the people that worked at the music store, they really talked me into, the idea that, boy, if Indianapolis could have a drum store like in the old days where they really went out and had different models, not just the starter stuff that a lot of general music stores had, but, pro level and lots of cymbals and lots of different stick choices. And I started getting stars in my eyes. Anybody that's bought a drum set or a vintage drum later on can get really emotionally attached.
Right.
And I was getting emotionally attached to a concept. I thought, man, this is great.
How old were you at this time?
I was about 37 at the time.
Okay.
And so I really got talked into it, but I allowed myself to get talked into it, and I just went to the bank and borrowed the money, and we opened the store, and I think we opened it for 30% over budget, but I had a ball. And I decided at that time that I wanted to have some advertising pieces in the store. So since Indianapolis was the home of Leedy, and I knew the Leedy name, I went and got a Leedy Elite.
So the collecting actually started after you opened. Are we talking Drum Center of Indianapolis? Right. I still had my, at that point, 24-year-old Ludwig drum set that I still have after, it's now a almost 50-year-old Ludwig drum set, and I wouldn't give that up for anything. And the vintage drum bug hit you right around that time after you opened the store? Yeah, so I bought, in fact, I think if you talk to Ned Ingbergman, now there's a name. I probably made his year in 1987. I just went and bought a whole bunch of stuff from him, and I think he thought that, he found the greatest customer he'd ever had, at least at that point. Now, and I just wanted to have, I wanted to have things sitting around the store so people could see. I wanted to use them as advertising pieces, but I wanted people to see where we came from. I see. And when you do that and you start taking things apart, or you look at them, and or what happens in drum stores and other music stores is people come in with boxes and old trap cases, and they're full of parts.
and then you all of a sudden go, oh, I know what that is. That's a, fill in the blank. That's a Ludwig muffler. That's a leady drum rod. That's a, you name it. That's a hi-hat part. I sort of elected myself to become the master of parts, and I cataloged them and, got them ready to either restore or sell. And, one thing led to another. Everybody's brains put together a little differently, and the way mine was, my brain seemed to be wired for trivia. I mean, it was like I could memorize part numbers and just recall things that I saw as a child when I would memorize catalogs. I mean, I was the guy who would walk in when somebody would say, "Well, that's a Slingerland Sky Blue Pearl." I was the guy who goes, "No, that's a Slingerland Light Blue Pearl." Ludwig called it Sky Blue Pearl.
Now, there's only one other
no,
guy.
It's not Black Oyster Pearl, it's Oyster Black Pearl. It's just the way my brain was wired. It was wired for trivia, so that helped it grow, that helped it work for me.
That's amazing, because you are known really as a drum historian, a very highly respected drum historian, and people look to you to many times, I think, appraise things or identify things or help them date these pieces, and I think that's there's a lot of trust involved there when the public will seek out Harry Cangany to do that, and you've been the name all these years. A name that you mentioned, back in the early days, and we could talk about some of these other people that were around in your day, and when you were getting started out. You mentioned Ned Ingberman from, is it Iowa? Libertyville, or Ned has been around a long time, right?
Yeah, Ned. Oh, yeah, Ned. There were 3 people that I can remember that were selling what I'd call vintage drums. There certainly were more. I can just recall 3 very easily. Probably the dean of it. Now, again, I'm talking about mid to late 80s. The dean was Charlie Donnelly. Charlie was an elderly guy. I never met him. We talked on the phone. His voice was very recognizable. He had a little drum shop in Rhode Island, and
was it Newington?
He would get a hold of things and describe them to you over the phone. He never sent a picture. He would just describe it. He would talk about it. And he was such an infectious human being that you'd buy it. And I don't ever remember having a problem. I don't remember anything ever coming in other than described. Charlie was just a kind of a one-man band, and so he was very early. Ned, certainly also. Ned, at that point, had this is before the Internet, Ned had a newsletter that he sent out, and you could talk to him on the phone, and he would describe things. Pictures could be sent, but again, it wasn't the Internet at that time, it was pictures. And then there was a store in Maryland called Master Musicians.
Okay.
A guy named Jonas Aronson, and he ran the place, and I bought a bunch of stuff from him. And somewhere along that line, again, this was a handful of people in the country, a handful, 100, who were interested in these, dusty, rusty, old drums.
What year would we be talking about right here with Ned and Charlie Donnelly and you? And
I'd say 86, 87.
Okay, so would you say that's when this whole thing really, started organizing as far as a community?
Well, there have always been used drums. I can remember, in the 60s and 70s, seeing used drums and people buying them for $1.
Yeah, they were called used drums, but when they started actually, okay, these are vintage drums, and there are vintage drum enthusiasts and like-minded people that get together to talk about these things. I think this is leading up to right before the books came out. Your books, John Aldridge's book.
Absolutely.
We can talk about those. Speaking of,
and the guy that really probably pulled everybody together was John Aldridge. John's probably about 51 now, so if you go back, about 25 years, he was just a young fella, 25, something like that, late 20s.
Yeah.
And John had been baptized in the faith of black beauties. He just thought the world of two-blood Ludwig drums.
Now, it's funny you should say that, because what I'm doing here on Vintage Drums Talk, I always say I kind of picking up where Rob Cook left off with his VHS tapes. If you remember years ago, he and John Aldridge talking just about what you're saying here, the Black Beauty section.
Yeah. John and I got to know each other on the phone, and for quite a while, I didn't know what he looked like, and he didn't know what I looked like, probably. And so we got talking, and I remember saying to him on the phone one time, I mean, this was early on, he wanted to know what I thought about Ludwig two-blood drums. Now, even then and now, I would consider myself a generalist. I never was interested in having, only Ludwig drums, or only Slingerland drums, or only,
it's funny really, because I always associated you with Leedy as being, the leading expert, and we'll get into that in a minute, but that's what I thought. But you surprised me when you told me it's really Ludwig and other brands.
Oh, sure. No, well, Leedy came about because they were a dinosaur. I mean, basically what happened was, let me finish the thing about John. So John called me and said, what do you think about Ludwig two-blood drums? And I said, well, why would anybody want to collect Ludwig drums? They're still in business. I was approaching this as I wanted examples from the companies that were gone, so that people could see something of that history. And I should tell you, history plays a large role in my life. My oldest is a history professor at Notre Dame. I mean,
wow.
History's always been very important with my children and family vacations. Let's do American history. Let's go to this famous place. It's just important. So John called me and said, what do you think about Ludwig? And I laughed about it. And then as I look back over the next few years, I spent more money on Ludwig drums than any other company. So anyway, what happened with Leedy was when I was a kid, and I had my brand new 1964 Ludwig set out in the backyard of my parents' house one day, just playing it and not caring how much noise I made.
What was the finish?
A retired man next door came, and he was great. He looked over the drums and said, that Ludwig was great, and they're pretty, but nobody made better drums than Leedy. And I sat there and thought, well, that's a crummy thing to say. Here I've got my brand new sparkle silver Ludwigs, and he's talking to me about Leedy. Now, in the 60s, the two big drum companies were Slingerland and Ludwig. And so it was almost an army. Guys who played Slingerland, and guys who played Ludwig, played Ludwig.
Yeah, I remember.
And you didn't go to the other side. And so he was talking about Leedy. Well, Leedy, when I was a teenager, was a division of Slingerland. And so I'm sitting there thinking, he's talking about Slingerland. I don't like Slingerland. I like Ludwig. And as the years went on, and I had the store open, and I got a Leedy drum, then I thought, well, I need to know more about Leedy, Indianapolis, because that's where this drum was made, and I don't know anything about it. And so I decided now's the time. And there wasn't, written material, but there were humans around. So there were people who had been at Leedy or knew the Leedys, or in my lucky case, the Leedys themselves.
All right.
So I got to know all of Mr. Leedy's children, and they're all gone now. The second oldest died this year at the ripe old age of 102.
Wow.
And there wasn't a finer example of a wonderful human being, a lady clear through than Mary Isabel Leedy Hampton. Great lady.
No.
I was kind of a surrogate son to her. She was kind of a surrogate mom to me, and we had, she has 4 daughters and their families, and then they just really took me in as if I were a Leedy relative. And some of it was the fact that I just think the world of her dad, and I wanted to tell his story. So the Mr. Leedy and the House of Wonder book came about because I promised her.
And I have that book right in my hand right now. I'm showing it to you folks. Collectors, if you don't have this book, you need to pick this up. It's really interesting. It's not quite like some of the other books that we'll talk a little bit about, because there was an era of books that were put out when we were talking about John Aldridge, and he put out the first one. There was a Ludwig book, and then along came Rob Cook with the Rogers book and the Slingerland book, But this one was Harry Cangany's second book, okay? Mr. Leedy, The House of Wonder, and he's going to tell you right now how this book came out. But remember, this is the second book. There was another book before this, and it's really an intricate book. But tell us the story about how Mr. Leedy, The House of Wonder came about.
Well, historically, George Way got an awful lot of credit because he was discovered, and he had an interesting career. He was with almost every drum company at some time,
right?
And then he had his own, which led to Camco, which led to DW, and so people know his name. Anyway, he got a lot of credit, but George Way wasn't in command at Leedy. He was the sales manager. He was an inventor, a tinkerer, and from all accounts, a great guy, a jovial guy. But it was U.G. Leedy's company. It was U.G. Leedy's money. It was his effort and his enthusiasm and his spirit that really directed that company. But he died so long ago. He died in January of 1931 that we didn't know much about him.
When did the company start, Leedy? When did Leedy actually start?
He started in 1894 in Indianapolis. The first name of it was Leedy and Cooley, and it wasn't the Cooley of Noble and Cooley. It was a clarinetist. And they started making snare drums and traps in an apartment, and then that led to doing it in the basement of a theater, and then that led to a room in a great big building not very far from where Leedy played snare drum in a pit orchestra. But I wanted to get that story out. But the other part of it is I had pictures from the estate of a foreman at Leedy, and I wanted those pictures published so that people could see what that factory looked like. And I can remember sending pictures to different people from time to time, like, sending pictures of the shell bending machine.
I believe we have some of those pictures, don't we? Yes, we do.
Well, yeah, the pictures are in the book. They're also, I discovered earlier this year, in the Smithsonian, in the archives of the Natural History Museum, which I think is a great place for them to be, so that I know that they're not lost. So they have the exact same set I have, except they have 4 more than I do. And these pictures were published in an issue of the Leedy Topics.
Uh-huh.
But the man from Indianapolis that I grew up knowing as Ray of Ray's Drum Service had been a foreman at Leedy, and I discovered all this after he was dead. If I'd only had the presence of mind to ask him questions, but I was a teenager.
That would have been invaluable. I mean, I think a lot of us have gone through a similar situation when we were younger. If only we would have been into this at that time and asked the right questions. And
sure.
Yeah.
And you want to do it before the storytellers are gone.
Yes.
So I wanted to get to the Leedy kids. I say kids, every one of them was at least 40 years older than me, but I wanted to get to Leedy kids and find out about Dad and Mom and anything they could tell me about the company and anybody else I could find that had anything to do with it. I had these pictures. I just wanted to tell the story. Now, luckily for me, the factory still stands. That building that started in 1910.
Today, it's still standing.
It's still standing.
Wow.
And so, and that's the story of this book, The House of Wonder. That factory's where an awful lot of things we take for granted started. For example, he built the first snare stand, and the first pearl covering went on, and there were other things. The great marimba business and xylophones that were built in that building.
Yeah.
So it's still standing. It was being turned into a school, and so the construction company let me in before they did rehabilitation of the building so that I could see. And there were things that very clearly I could identify from the 1925 pictures.
That's incredible. Now, I'm looking at the book. I'm looking at page 38 and 39. I'm not sure if you know exactly what photos are on those pages, but there's some great factory shots in here of metal shell production and the main machine room, and it just really, these types of pictures just they're a time capsule. I look at them and I can get the vibe of the factory and that era. And it's just amazing that you have these pictures and you were kind enough to send me some, and we're going to show them here. But this is just a fascinating story. Continue with how this book came about.